Okay, for this section, so we've done factoring by grouping, factoring using difference of squares. There's also some in difference of cubes, but it's a short class and it's hard to get into everything. So we're going to just do factoring trinomials. So we've done greatest common factor, which is important in all of it. So for factoring trinomials, there's a couple ways to do it. These are the simpler cases where trial and error or guess and check is probably the easiest thing to do. In the next section, I'll show you a little bit, if they're a little bit harder or a different way that you can do it. So we want to factor this here. So you want to factor into a product like this. If everything's positive, everything would have to be positive down here. If you have a minus thrown in there, then something, has to be a minus somewhere. So usually for these, like I said, the easiest thing to do is guess and check. When your coefficient is a 1 here in front of the x squared, or if it's a prime number, because if it's a prime number, the only way to get prime numbers is 1 in itself. If it's a small number, like 4, there's only a couple ways you could get 4. You can do 1 times 4, 2 times 2. So for those cases, guess and check's probably the easiest. Anytime the coefficient in front of your square term's a 1, though, guess and check's usually a safe bet, because to get an x squared, the only possible way is to do an x times an x. So when you FOIL this, you're basically going backwards from FOILing it out. So x times x gives you x squared. That's the only option you have. To get a positive 8, though, you do have a couple options. You can do 1 times 8 or 2 times 4. The thing is that they have to multiply together to give you 8, and then they have to add to give you the 6. So if you do 1 times 8, that does not add up to give you 6, but 2 times 4 does. So there's your factoring. So if you multiply this out, FOIL it back out to check it, x times x is x squared, 4x plus 2x is 6x, and 2 times 4 is 8. So like I said, you're doing the reverse of multiplying, so you're doing the reverse of FOIL. And so anytime this coefficient's a 1 or, a small number or a prime number, guess and check's usually easy to do. So for this one here, you've got y squared minus 5y plus 6. So again, the coefficient in front of your squared term is a 1. So the only way to get a y squared is to do a y times a y. And then you've got a positive 6 but a negative 5, which means that you need to they have to multiply together to give you a positive 6, and they have to add up to negative 5. So to get a 6, you can do a 1 and 6 or a 2 and a 3. So the only way to multiply to get a positive 6 but add to a negative 5 would be if they were both negative. Because if only one's negative, then this last term would have to be negative. But in order to multiply to a positive, you have to do a negative times a negative. And then what two numbers would add up to 5 that multiply to 6? Well, that would be a 2 and a 3. And if you did it wrong, if you had put like, let me just do it over here. If you'd done like y minus 1 times y minus 6 to start with or something like that, or y plus 6, let's say, for instance, because negative 1 plus 6 is still negative. Did my minuses wrong. That's a bad example. Let me switch. I'm sorry. Let me do y plus 1, y minus 6. Okay, because if you FOIL this back out, y times y is y squared, minus 6y plus y is minus 5y, but then if you do plus 1 times minus 6, then that's negative 6, which is not the answer. So then you might try switching signs, which would go back to what I had here. Could have left it alone, didn't have to necessarily scribble it out. But then if you do it this way, you got y times y is y squared, plus 6y minus y, well, that's positive 5y, so that's not it either. So if you write down the wrong thing to start with, you just check it, and if it doesn't work, then you try something else. So that's the guess and check method. Usually when I do it, you can kind of see how the way I think about it. If they have to multiply to positive but add to negative, then they both have to be not minus, okay? And so then what factors of 6 will add up to 5? Well, 2 and 3. For the next one here, again, the a squared, the coefficient's 1. So the only way to get an a squared is an a times an a. This time, though, they have to multiply to a negative They have to multiply to negative 6 and add up to a positive 1. So if they have to multiply to a negative, then one of them will be a positive and one of them will be a minus. Well, so then you ask yourself, okay, what factors of 6 will add up to 1? So you've got 6 and 1. No way will that give you a 1. You've got 3 and 2. Okay, so you can try 3 and 2 and check it. And if it doesn't work, switch them around and check it. The other way to think about it is if you need them to multiply to a negative but add to a positive, then the positive one has to be the bigger number. If you need them to multiply to a negative and add to a negative, then the bigger number has to be negative. So if you want to think about it that way. So you've got a times a is a squared, a times minus 2a, and then 3 times a is minus 2a plus 3a, which is positive a, and 3 times negative 2 is negative 6. So like the opposite one is here, where you have to multiply to a negative and add to a negative. So the only way to get a y squared is to do a y times a y. And you have to multiply to a negative, so one's positive and one's negative. But this time you have to add to a negative. So if you need to add to a negative, the bigger number is going to be negative. So what factors of 32 will add to 4? So if you need to, you can go over on the side and write down factors of 32. You know, you got 1 and 32, 2 and 16, and, you know, do it that way. That's fine. But 32 is 4 and 8. 8 and 4 give you a 4. So, and you want it to be a negative 4, which, like I said, means that your bigger number would need to be the negative 1 and your smaller number would need to be the positive 1. If you had it backwards when you checked it, you would have a positive 4, so you could switch it around. So check this one. Y times y is y squared. Y times 8, negative 8 is negative 8y, plus 4y is negative 4y, and then 4 times negative 8 is negative 32. So on this one here, you got 3a squared plus 24a plus 36. So the first thing you can do is factor out the 3, the greatest common factor of 3. And you can do this last, but I always think it's easier to factor out your greatest common factor first, because it makes your number, if you can factor out a number, it makes your number smaller, or it makes, you know, things more manageable to make things smaller, less exponents, or whatever the case is. So if you factor out a 3, you're left with this. So then your greatest common factor just follows this around. And so to get an a squared, you have to do a times a. They're all positive, so everything has to be positive. Factors of 12 that add up to 8 would be, if you do 1 and 12, that won't work. 2 and 6 add up to 8. So there's your answer. And if you multiply it back out, it does work. For this one here, again, you can factor out your greatest common factor first. They each have an x. So we're left with x squared minus 8x plus 15. So the x is just going to follow along. To get an x squared, we have to do x times x. And this time we need to multiply to a positive but add to a negative, which means they both have to be negative. It's the only way that'll work. So factors of 15 that'll add to 8 would be 3 and 5. So we've got a minus 5 and a minus 3. And if you multiply all this back out, it does in fact work. So guess and check. You can, like I was showing you up here, write down different cases, multiply it out, see if it works. Or if you'll just think about it, if they're all positive, everything has to be positive. If the last term's positive but this term's negative, then they both have to be negative, because that's the only way to multiply to a positive and add to a negative. And then if the last term's negative, then you know you're going to have a plus and a minus. And like I said, if the middle term's negative, the bigger number will be a negative. If the middle term is positive, like up here, the bigger number will be a positive.